Eli was only 12, but the weight on his small shoulders made him feel twice that age. He lived with his grandmother, Margaret, in a rundown trailer on the edge of a forgotten town in rural Ohio. His parents had died in a car crash when he was just 5. Since then, the only warmth he knew came from the brittle hands and fading eyes of the woman who had raised him with quiet strength and unconditional love. Their days passed like whispers, soft, repetitive, sometimes cold. Margaret's health had been declining for years. Arthritis made it hard for her to move around, and the medication she needed was more expensive than their monthly groceries. Their only income came from the small pile of cans, glass bottles, and discarded scrap that Eli collected every morning before sunrise. Rain or snow, wind or frost, he would quietly slip on his oversized hoodie, grab the dented cart behind their trailer, and head into town. Most mornings, the streets were empty, except for the flickering neon signs from the 24-hour diner and the stray cats rummaging through trash bins. People saw Eli, but only in passing, like a shadow, like a boy-shaped silence that never asked for help. No one knew how often he skipped meals so his grandmother could have a warm bowl of soup. No one saw him counting nickels in the candlelight, or patching holes in his shoes with tape. But Eli didn't complain. He had grown up understanding that life didn't always give you choices. It gave you moments, and you either rose in them, or you faded. The little trailer at the end of Birchwood Lane wasn't much, just a rusted tin roof, paper-thin walls, and a second-hand space heater that groaned louder than it warmed. But to Eli, it was home. The soft hum of his grandmother's breathing at night. The way she called him my brave boy, even when he cried quietly in the dark. These were the only comforts he needed. Sometimes, when the night was too cold to sleep, Eli would stand by the window and look at the stars, wondering if his parents could see him. He'd whisper promises to them. "I'll take care of her. I'll keep her safe. I'm trying. I really am." And then he'd crawl back into the thin blanket, hugging himself against the chill, hoping tomorrow would be just a little kinder. Eli was poor, but not broken. He was lonely, but not without purpose. And though the world often passed him by, he held on to something stronger than comfort. He held on to hope. It was on one of those freezing nights, as the wind howled through the gaps in the trailer walls, and Margaret coughed endlessly in her sleep, that fate quietly took a step forward. As Eli trudged home with his half-filled bag of recyclables, soaked from the sudden downpour, he heard a faint whimper beneath the bridge that led to the woods behind their trailer park. He stopped. The sound was so soft he almost thought he imagined it, but it came again, barely audible over the rain. A cry, a plea, not human, small, frightened. Eli's heart skipped. He turned, narrowed his eyes into the darkness, and tightened his grip on the cart handle. He could have gone home. He should have gone home. But something in that sound, something vulnerable, something lost, called out to the very ache he carried inside. And that, was the beginning. The moment Eli stepped toward that cry in the night, neither he nor the world around him would ever be the same again. Let us follow his next steps into the shadows, toward the unknown, where one act of compassion would awaken a bond deeper than blood, stronger than fear, and more enduring than time itself. The storm rolled in without warning, that night, low clouds dragging across the sky like old tired ghosts, and wind slapping against the trailer walls as if trying to shake the world awake. Rain came fast, pelting down in hard, cold sheets that soaked through Eli's sweatshirt within seconds. He was halfway home, pushing his rattling cart of soggy cans through the side streets, when the wind nearly knocked him sideways. Most kids his age would have been curled up on a warm couch, playing games or sipping cocoa. Eli didn't know that life. His cocoa came in dreams, and his warmth, if any, came from the thought that Margaret would have her medicine tomorrow, even if it meant he went to bed hungry tonight. As he rounded the path near the abandoned overpass, just a few hundred feet from home, he heard it again. That sound, it wasn't thunder. It wasn't the groan of tree limbs. It was something softer, something struggling, a whimper. He froze, his sneakers sinking slightly in the mud, his heart thudding, louder than the storm itself. The sound came again, thin and broken, barely rising above the rain, but unmistakable. Eli squinted toward the edge of the embankment, where a patch of wild overgrowth dipped into a drainage ditch beneath the bridge. The streetlights didn't reach there. It was the kind of place the world forgot, the kind of place where suffering could happen unseen. He hesitated, just for a breath. He was cold. He was tired. His hands were numb, and his stomach ached with emptiness. But he knew what it felt like to cry in the dark and hope someone might hear. So he dropped his cart and stepped toward the sound. His shoes sloshed through puddles, As he reached the edge of the ditch, pulling the small flashlight from his hoodie pocket, it flickered almost dead but just enough to catch the glint of something down below. There, curled tight against a boulder, soaked to the bone, was a dog, large, black-furred, shivering violently. Its back leg was twisted unnaturally, blood mixing with the rainwater around it. Its eyes dark and wide locked onto Eli's, filled with pain, but also with something more. A flicker of trust, a silent, desperate plea. Eli dropped to his knees, heart racing. "It's okay," he whispered, his breath misting in the air. "I'm here. I won't leave you." Carefully, he slid down the embankment, ignoring the thorns that scratched his arms. The closer he got, the more he saw. This wasn't just any dog. It wore a collar-thick leather, worn but strong. Number tags. But something told Eli this dog hadn't always been alone. He reached out slowly, and the dog didn't flinch. It just let out a soft groan, its head sinking into the mud. "I got you," Eli said, almost to himself. Lifting the animal was like lifting a bag of brick sweat, heavy and limp with exhaustion. But Eli didn't stop. He wrapped it in his coat, pulling the dog close against his chest, feeling the weight of its body and the trust it had just handed over without a word. Step by step, he trudged back home, arms burning, legs shaking, mud caked his jeans. His sneakers squelched with every step. But he never once thought of turning back. He had no plan, no clear idea of what to do next. All he knew was that this life, this small and hurting life in his arms, mattered. When he reached the trailer, the porch light was outblown by the wind. Margaret was asleep inside, coughing in her dreams. Eli laid the dog gently on an old blanket in the corner, then rummaged through their modest bathroom for anything that could help antiseptic. Clean cloth, a roll of gauze nearly out. He worked quietly, carefully, the way his grandmother had shown him when she used to treat his scraped knees years ago. Each touch was gentle, every whisper soft. The dog didn't cry, didn't whimper, just watched him, those same dark eyes filled with weariness and wonder. Margaret woke sometime near dawn, finding her grandson curled beside a strange, wounded animal, his hands stained with dried blood and his clothes still dripping. "Eli," she said, her voice hoarse with concern. "What in God's name?" He looked up slowly, eyes rimmed red with exhaustion. "He was hurt, Grandma. I couldn't leave him." She stared at him for a long time, then at the dog, then back again. Her breath caught, her expression softening in that way only grandmothers. "No." And then, she simply nodded. "We'll figure it out," she whispered, kneeling beside them both. "We always do." Outside, the rain was letting up. The first gray hints of dawn stretched across the sky. Inside that fragile trailer, a new kind of warmth had begun to stir, not from heaters or hot food, but from something deeper. A bond had been born that night, between boy and beasts, between loneliness and loyalty, between one soul who had almost given up, and another who had never been given a chance. But neither Eli nor the dog knew just how deeply this stormy night would change everything, how it would draw enemies out of shadows and summon dangers neither of them could yet imagine. Still, for now, in that moment, they simply had each other, and that was enough to begin with. The morning after the storm brought no sunshine, only a heavy gray stillness that seemed to press down on everything. Inside the trailer, the air was damp and thick with the scent of wet fur and antiseptic. Eli hadn't slept. He sat cross-legged, on the floor beside the dog, who now rested quietly on the blanket, its breathing shallow but steady. Margaret, seated on the worn sofa, watched her grandson with eyes that carried both love and concern. She held her chipped teacup with both hands, warming her fingers, as she tried to make sense of what this new presence in their already fragile world would mean. "Eli," she said gently, "we can barely feed ourselves. What makes you think we can care for a dog, especially one that needs a vet?" Eli didn't look up. He was dabbing a fresh cloth over the wound on the dog's leg, careful not to hurt him. His voice was quiet but certain. "I know, Grandma. I know we don't have much. But he needs someone, and maybe I need him too." Margaret didn't reply right away. She understood things not because they were logical, but because they were felt. She'd been through enough hard winters and empty cupboards to know that sometimes the heart had to make decisions the wallet couldn't afford. She saw in Eli's hands not just a child's stubbornness, but a boy choosing love over ease, purpose over survival. With a soft sigh, she nodded. "A few days," she said, "until he can walk. After that, we'll figure out what comes next." Eli finally looked up, relief flickering across his tired face. "Thank you," he whispered. That afternoon, he named the dog Max. The name came, easy, short, strong, simple, just like the bond that was quietly forming between them. Max didn't move much, but he followed Eli's every step with his eyes. When Eli crouched down to whisper to him, the dog's tail twitched, barely noticeable. But real. From that day on, Eli rearranged his life. He woke earlier, headed into town before the streetlights blinked off. He gathered bottles and cans in silence, moving faster than before, trying to save a few extra minutes to return home sooner. Margaret noticed he ate less, skipped meals entirely some days. When she pressed him, he simply smiled. "I'm okay, Grandma. Max needs the meat more than I do." Their cupboards grew quieter, but the trailer didn't feel empty. The presence of the dog, gentle, watchful, brought a sense of life that had been missing for a long time. Eli would sit beside Max in the evenings, reading aloud from his schoolbooks, stroking the dog's head while the rain tapped softly on the tin roof. Neighbors began to whisper. They saw the boy carrying leftovers instead of eating at the church pantry. They wondered about the dark shape lying behind the thin curtain in the window, but no one asked. People rarely did. It was Margaret who watched the most. Each night, she saw her grandson grow leaner, but also stronger in spirit, in devotion. She saw the way Max responded only to Eli, how the dog tensed around strangers, but softened when the boy spoke. One evening, as Eli sat beside Max humming an old folk tune his mother used to sing, Margaret sat quietly at the kitchen table, holding a spoon over a pot of thin soup. Her voice broke the silence, soft as a whisper through wind-blown leaves. "He's not just a stray, is he?" Eli hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe he was once." Margaret nodded, eyes still on the bubbling broth. "He carries something in him, something trained, something bruised." Eli didn't answer, but in his silence, he confirmed what she feared and what he had tried not to admit to himself. Max wasn't just any dog. Still, Eli chose to care for him, even when their own world was fragile. Even when it meant less food, fewer comforts, and more risk. He chose compassion, not because it was safe or easy, but because it was right. And in doing so, he awakened something within Max, too. The dog, though wounded, began to change. His breathing steadied, his eyes grew clearer, his ears perked at the sound of Eli's footsteps, and his tail wagged up wildly, but deliberately, like a promise made in silence. They were healing each other, but the world, as always, watches closely when something good begins to grow in secret. And from the edges of their quiet life, shadows were already gathering. One evening, as Eli reached down to adjust Max's blanket, he noticed something new, a glint beneath the matted fur on the dog's neck. A collar, not just any collar but thick, military-grade leather, a faintly embossed insignia, barely legible. Eli ran his fingers across it, heart tightening. "Who were you, Max?" he whispered. Max didn't answer. He simply looked back at Eli with a steady, unwavering gaze. That night, Eli barely slept. The warmth between them was real, but so was the danger that might come with it. Still, when he awoke the next morning and found Max sleeping peacefully at his side, head resting on the boy's chest as if it belonged there, Eli made a quiet vow, one that would guide every decision. In the days to come, he would protect Max. No matter who came looking. And as the first rays of morning pierced through the clouds, Eli didn't know yet, but this choice, this fierce loyalty to something wounded and voiceless, would soon be put to the ultimate test. The days that followed unfolded slowly, like the careful unwrapping of an old letter, soft at the edges, delicate in their weight. Time moved differently inside the little trailer. It didn't rush or demand. It watched quietly as two wounded souls began the quiet work of stitching each other back together. Eli had always known how to endure, but now he was learning how to nurture. His days began in the blue hush before dawn, when frost still clung to the trailer windows and the world outside had not yet stirred. He'd slip on his patched boots, grab his collection sack, and make his way down Birchwood Lane, walking with purpose through the sleepy silence of back alleys and parking lots, collecting bottles and scrap, moving with the urgency of someone who understood that time, now more than ever, was precious. Each morning, before he left, he'd refill a small bowl of water and place a few slices of deli meat generously donated by a sympathetic store clerk beside Max's blanket. The dog, though still weak, would lift his head and thump his tail once, as if to say, "Be safe, kid. I'll be here when you get back." When Eli returned, often wet and exhausted, Max would greet him with quiet eyes and a low wag of the tail. Not exuberant, not like the neighborhood dogs Eli used to watch from a distance, but calm, steady, present. It was the kind of welcome you get from someone who doesn't just love you but trusts you. Max's leg, though still tender, had begun to heal under Eli's patient care. The crude bandage was replaced daily, cleaned with warm water and antiseptic. Eli's fingers, clumsy at first, had become steady and sure. And Max, for all his size and strength, lay still beneath those hands, not out of fear, but out of surrender. There was a sacredness to those quiet evenings. Margaret would sit in her armchair knitting scarves for the local shelter, the TV humming softly in the background, while Eli curled beside Max on the floor with an old paperback, reading aloud stories neither of them had heard before. Sometimes, Max would nudge the book with his nose when Eli stopped reading, as if asking for just one more page. Outside, winter whispered through the trees, but inside, something warmer than heat wrapped itself around the three of them. A boy, a dog, and a grandmother, bound not by blood or circumstance, but by choice. By the simple, defiant act of caring. But healing was never just physical. Max still flinched at sudden sounds. Once, when a car backfired outside, he bolted upright, growling low, eyes wide with fear. Eli rushed to his side, kneeling gently, both hands on Max's trembling body. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe here, I promise." Over time, those moments grew fewer. Max began to sleep more deeply, his body uncurled, his breathing soft and unguarded. Sometimes, he'd rest his head in Eli's lap, as if the boy's presence itself was a balm for old wounds. And Eli, he was changing too. For the first time since his parents died, he smiled without forcing it. His shoulders, once hunched with worry, began to lift. He laughed more softly, but often, with Max by his side. The world didn't feel quite so cruel. Margaret noticed it all. She watched her grandson feed the dog before himself. She saw him give away half his sandwich without a second thought. And while part of her heart ached to see him shoulder so much so young, another part was proud, so deeply proud, because in a world that so often teaches people to close up and protect only themselves, Eli had chosen instead to open, to give, to love, to heal. One afternoon, as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, Margaret found Eli outside, sitting on the back step, Max's head resting against his knee. She stepped out, wrapped in her old shawl, and sat beside them. "You've changed, Eli," she said gently. Eli looked up, puzzled. "Changed? In the best way," she smiled. "You walk a little taller now. Not just because you're growing, but because you're needed. You've found someone who needs you just as much as you need him." Eli didn't speak. He looked down at Max, then back up at his grandmother. His eyes shimmered. "I guess we're healing each other." Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand. "That's the best kind of healing there is." For a while, the three of them sat in silence, watching the sun slip behind the trees, casting long, golden shadows across the grass. Max lifted his head slightly, ears perked, as if sensing something in the air, and energy shifting, a presence drawing near. And it was. Because as night fell once again over Birchwood Lane, and as Eli tucked Max in with one last whisper of comfort, neither of them could know that, beyond the quiet trees, a story was being told. A missing dog, a valuable asset, a reward for information. Eyes were beginning to watch. Questions were beginning to stir, and the bond they had built in love and silence was about to be tested by forces much louder and far more dangerous than either of them had ever known. But for now, they had peace, and tomorrow they would still have each other. At least, they hoped. It happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the kind of slow day where even the wind seemed to pause between gusts. Eli had just returned from the recycling yard, hands scratched and jeans caked with dry mud. Max was lying on his blanket by the window, one ear twitching in rhythm with the breeze, his dark eyes half closed in the comfort of familiarity, as Eli knelt to offer him a strip of leftover roast beef he had saved from lunch at the church kitchen. His fingers brushed something unusual beneath the dog's thick fur, something hard, smooth, and foreign. Curious, Eli leaned closer and parted the fur just above Max's collarbone. That's when he saw it clearly for the first time. A collar, unlike any he'd ever seen. Thick, military-grade leather, double-stitched with reinforced buckles. Embedded near the clasp was a small metal tag, weathered but still legible under the grime and wear of time. And there, etched into the tag in blocky, cold letters, were the words, "Property of Federal K-9 Unit, do not remove." Eli froze. His mind blurred for a moment. He blinked, rubbed the tag with his thumb, hoping maybe he'd read it wrong. But it was still there, plain as day, stark as truth. Max wasn't just a stray. He wasn't lost in the ordinary sense. He was MISSING, a working dog, a federal dog, possibly trained in search and rescue, detection, even pursuit. Suddenly, all of Max's behaviors, the way he responded instantly to sharp sounds, how he scanned doorways before walking through, the way he growled at strangers but never at uniformed people, clicked into place like puzzle pieces. Finally, finding their home, Eli's stomach dropped. He sat back slowly, staring at the dog who, at that moment, lifted his head and looked at him with the same calm eyes as always. Loyal, trusting, unafraid. "What happened to you?" Eli whispered, but Max didn't move. He just watched the boy with a gaze that carried 1,000 stories too heavy for words. That night, Eli could barely eat. He sat at the dinner table, his fork pushing beans around his plate as Margaret gently set her spoon down and asked, "You all right, honey?" Eli hesitated. The truth pressed at his chest, but he wasn't ready to speak it. "Not yet. Just tired," he replied. But sleep didn't come easy. Lying on his cot that night, Eli stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks of the trailer settling into the cold. Max was curled up at his side, breathing deep, unaware, perhaps simply unconcerned about the storm that had begun inside Eli's heart. There was a choice to be made, a crossroads. If he called the number printed on that tag or brought Max into the police, there was no doubt someone, somewhere, would be looking for this dog. And they'd probably offer a reward, maybe even a big one. Enough to buy food, medicine, fix the roof, maybe even move somewhere new. But to do that would mean giving Max up, letting go of the friend who had become more than a companion, the only one who had truly seen Eli not as the poor kid, the forgotten one, but simply as someone worth curling beside at night. And what if Max didn't want to go back? What if whoever had him before didn't treat him kindly? That scar on his leg, was it from training, or something worse? The questions spun like leaves in wind, and with each one, Eli felt smaller, more conflicted. His heart was a war zone, hope and guilt firing shots at each other across a battlefield of silence. The next morning, the choice became even harder. The town's community bulletin board had been updated. On his way to the recycling center, Eli passed it as usual, but something new caught his eye. A flyer, bright yellow, bold print, missing canine unit dogs, specialized training substantial. Reward if found. Do not approach. Report immediately. There, printed just below the bold text, was a photo. Max, mouth open, in a mid-run stance, wearing the same collar, same deep eyes, but, in this image, he looked stronger, healthier, different, and yet, unmistakably him. Eli stepped back. His chest tightened. The world began to feel less kind again, so someone was looking. And now the whole town would be too. He thought of Margaret's medication, the way she coughed at night, the cracked window above her bed they hadn't been able to replace. How easy it would be to make that call, to trade this secret for the security he'd been denied for so long. But as he walked back home, the wind brushing cold across his cheeks, Eli kept hearing one quiet memory. The night Max had rested his head against his chest after surgery. The trust in that moment, the warmth, that wasn't something you could put a price on. By the time he reached the trailer, his decision had been made. He stepped inside, shut the door behind him, and crouched beside Max. The dog thumped his tail, twice, wagging it against the floor. Eli leaned in and whispered, "Don't worry, I'm not letting them take you." Max didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He looked up, blinked slowly, and pressed his head gently into Eli's shoulder. A silent agreement, a promise. But outside, the world was catching up, and while Eli had chosen compassion over comfort once again, forces beyond their trailer walls were beginning to move on. Not all of them wore badges. From that day forward, Eli began to watch the shadows more carefully. He walked different streets, avoided lingering near the bulletin board. He fed Max quietly, always behind drawn curtains. He began to plan, not just for survival, but for protection. Because secrets, once uncovered, don't stay quiet for long. And, soon, someone else would come looking. Not with love, but with danger. For the next few days, Eli walked with a weight that had nothing to do with the sack of recyclables slung over his shoulder. It was heavier than metal and more tiring than cold weather. It was the burden of knowing he held something the world wanted, something that came with a price tag and a deadline. Each time he passed the community board, the yellow flyer seemed to glow brighter. Like it knew he'd seen it. Like it was calling out his name. Missing Canine Unit Dog Substantial Reward. And beneath it, that photo Max, frozen in time, upright and alert, looking proud. Owned. Claimed. Eli knew what that reward could do. It could patch the leaking roof over Margaret's bed. Replace her arthritis medication that was now half-dosed to last longer. Bring heat into the trailer without the groan of the struggling space heater. It could fill the pantry. Buy real clothes. Give them, maybe for the first time, a breath without fear. But it would cost him Max. And there are some trades that feel like selling a part of your soul. At night, he lay awake, listening to Margaret's soft cough echo through the thin walls, while Max snored gently by the foot of his bed, tail twitching with dreams. Eli would reach out in the dark, lay a hand over the dog's warm side, and feel that rhythm slow, safe, steady. It had become his anchor. In a world full of less than, Max made him feel like enough. Margaret noticed his silence. She always did. One morning, as she folded laundry beside the window, she spoke without turning. That dog's not just any dog, is he? Eli paused. No, ma'am, someone's looking. Yes. She folded the last towel and set it aside. You thinking about calling? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Margaret turned then, looked him straight in the eye, and said something he'd never forget. Sometimes, doing the right thing feels like handing away the only piece of light you've got. But sometimes, holding on to what's right for you is what saves you in the end. Eli looked down. I just don't want to lose him. You already lost enough, baby, she said, coming over and brushing a hand through his hair. Whatever you decide, just don't let fear make the decision for you. He nodded, but her words only deepened the ache. Because fear was making noise, loud, unrelenting noise. What if someone recognized Max? What if they came and took him by force? What if they accused Eli of stealing, of hiding, of breaking the law? Fear wasn't a voice in his head. It was the knock he expected at the door every time someone passed. Too close. Still, every time he looked into Max's eyes, saw the calm there, the faith, the loyalty. He knew what he was fighting for. Max had never asked to be saved. He never barked or begged. He simply trusted that Eli wouldn't trade him away. And that kind of trust, it changes you. One afternoon, Eli stood again in front of the flyer. He stared at it until the lines blurred. He thought about calling, thought about tearing it down, thought about what it would feel like to walk home without Max ever knowing he'd been given up. Then, slowly, quietly, he pulled a pen from his pocket. In the white space at the bottom of the flyer, beneath the hotline number and reward promise, he wrote 5 small words. He's safe. Please stop looking. Then he walked away. That night, for the first time in weeks, Eli slept soundly. Max lay beside him, his breathing slow and deep, one paw resting over the boy's ankle like a silent thank you. Margaret, watching from her chair in the dark, wiped a tear from her cheek and whispered a prayer into the stillness. But in the world beyond their trailer, silence had a way of drawing attention, and while Eli had chosen loyalty over comfort, compassion over currency, others were beginning to move not out of love, not out of hope, but out of suspicion. Because where there's a reward, there's always someone willing to look a little harder, and soon, the cost of Eli's choice would rise higher than he ever imagined. There's a strange quiet that settles in when trouble is nearer, kind of stillness that doesn't feel peaceful, but watchful. As if the trees are holding their breath. As if the wind is listening more than blowing. That's the quiet Eli started noticing. At first, it was just a feeling. A twinge in his chest when he walked the usual path through the alley behind the laundromat. A chill when he passed the corner near Old Miller's gas station. No one said anything. No one did anything. But sometimes he'd look up and see a car parked just a little too long. Someone inside pretending to check their phone while their eyes traced his every move. He tried to shake it off. Maybe he was being paranoid. Maybe the pressure of keeping Max hidden was turning everyday things into shadows. But that uneasy silence kept following him. And it had a weight to it that couldn't be explained away. Then came the whispers. At the recycling yard. He overheard 2 workers talking near the sorting bins. Dog like that ain't just any mud. Heard there's money in it. Yeah. Some kid's been dragging one around this side of town. I heard. He kept his head down, heart pounding. They weren't looking at him. Not directly. But the words clung to his skin like cold mist. He walked home faster that day, checking behind him every few blocks. Max met him at the door, tail thudding, unaware of the fear growing behind the boy's eyes. That night, Eli didn't eat. He sat by the window, watching the curtains stay drawn. But every few minutes he'd peek out, scanning the empty road. Birchwood Lane was never busy, but now, its quiet felt unnatural. Margaret knew something was wrong, but she didn't press. She simply placed her worn hand over his and whispered, "You're not alone in this. Don't carry it all by yourself." But Eli did carry it. He carried it in every step, in every glance, in the constant worry that someone would come knocking, not kindly, not with questions, but with demands. The real confirmation came 2 days later. Eli had taken Max for a late-night walk behind the trailer park, through the woods that bordered the riverbank. Max was healing better, now his limp less pronounced, his steps more confident. He moved with quiet awareness, ears always tilted, nose twitching at every rustle. They were halfway down the path when Max suddenly stopped. His ears went rigid, his body stiffened. A low growl built in his throat. Eli froze. "What is it, boy?" And then he saw it just for a second. A flicker of movement behind the trees. A shape to still, a breath where there shouldn't be one. Someone was there watching. He turned fast, pulling Max by the collar. "Come on, we need to go." They didn't run. They walked fast. Eli knew better than to draw attention. But the hair on his neck didn't. Lies were following, and they didn't feel friendly. By the time they reached the trailer, Eli bolted the door. Max paced by the entrance, growling under his breath for minutes before settling. Eli peeked out the back window. Nothing. But the feeling remained. That night, he finally told Margaret everything. About the collar, the tag, the flyer, the decision not to call, the cars, the woods. She listened without interruption. Then she did something she rarely did. She reached into the drawer under her bed and pulled out a worn, old pistol. She held it in both hands, looked at it like a memory, and said, "I haven't touched this in 15 years. But I think it's time we remember how to be ready." Eli's breath caught. "You don't think they'd hurt us?" Margaret looked at him with eyes steady and kind, but unflinching. "People get strange when money's on the line. And if that dog is worth what I think he is, there are folks out there who'd rather take than ask." From that night on, the lights in the trailer never went off completely. Max stayed close. The old pistol rested in Margaret's nightstand, and he stopped walking the main roads. He changed his routines. He hid Max when anyone came by. But secrets don't stay hidden forever. And sometimes, when people want something bad enough, they don't wait for a door to open. They break it down. What Eli didn't know was that across town, in a smoke-filled room behind a shuttered auto shop, 2 men were talking. One of them was staring at a photo, the same photo from the flyer. "He's got the dog," the man said. "Kid lives with his grandma off Birchwood." The other leaned forward, his voice low and cold. "Then let's make him talk." Trouble wasn't watching anymore. It was coming. It started with a knock. Not the kind of knock that asks permission, but the kind that takes it hard, sharp, repeated. 3 pounds against the trailer door, loud enough to rattle the frame and freeze the breath in Eli's lungs. Margaret looked up from her chair, knitting needles still in hand, her face tightening with instinct. Max was already on his feet, body tense, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Eli stepped slowly toward the window, pulling the curtain back just an inch, just enough to see the black pickup parked crookedly by the curb. 2 men stood on the porch. One leaned in, pressing a hand against the doorframe. The other scanned the windows like he was counting ways in. Eli's heart slammed against his ribs. They weren't police. They weren't neighbors. And they weren't here by accident. He turned to Margaret, voice trembling. "It's them." Her knitting fell to the floor. "Get your things out the back now." Eli didn't argue. He grabbed his worn backpack already packed, just in case, and whistled low for Max. The dog didn't hesitate. In seconds, they were out the back door and into the tall grass behind the trailer, the wind whipping past their faces like a warning. Behind them, the door burst open. "Where is he?" a voice shouted. Eli ducked low, moving fast through the brush, his legs stinging from the dry weeds. Max stayed close, silent, focused. They didn't stop. They didn't look back. They knew the woods better than anyone, every shortcut, every hiding spot, every fallen tree and pathless trail. But still, this was different. This wasn't a game. This wasn't curiosity or fear. This was survival. They ran until the lights of the trailer park disappeared behind them, swallowed by trees and distance. When they finally stopped, Eli fell to his knees by the creek bed, gasping for air. Hands trembling. Max stood guard, nose high, ears forward. Eli looked at him, barely whispering. What did they want? Max, why you? He already knew part of the answer, the collar, the flyer, the whispers. But it wasn't just about a missing dog anymore. This was bigger, meaner. And suddenly, Eli remembered the way Max had reacted to certain sounds. Not just cautious, but trained, tactical. The scars, the alert posture, the complete obedience when danger was near. Max wasn't just a dog that got lost. He was a dog that got away, which meant someone had something to lose. Maybe evidence, maybe secrets, maybe both. And Max somehow was the key. Eli felt the cold creep into his clothes, but not just from the night air. It was the chill of understanding. Max wasn't a lost pet. He was a witness, a threat, and Eli had been hiding him in plain sight. They couldn't go back. Not now. Not with those men knowing where they lived. Not with Margaret alone. Panic bloomed in Eli's chest like fire. We have to go back, he whispered, standing suddenly. They might hurt her. Max barked one sharp, low, agreeing. But how? He couldn't fight men like that. He didn't even have a phone. No car, no help. Unless ... He remembered something. A face, a voice, a man in uniform who came to the food pantry once a week, offering rides to appointments, checking in on the kids whose homes didn't always have doors that locked. Officer James. Kind, quiet, always watching, but never pushing. Eli didn't know where he lived, but he knew the station, the small precinct near Main Street with the worn flag out front, and the bench covered in bird droppings. It was miles away, but he had to try. We go to him, Eli told Max. We go now. He shoved a piece of bread from his bag into his pocket for Max, took one deep breath, and began to move again through the woods, toward the town lights just barely glowing. Through the branches. Each step was a fight against fear, against cold, against the weight of what he now understood. He was just a kid, yes, but he carried something that mattered. A truth no one else seemed willing to protect. A life the world had nearly thrown away. Max followed without question. And somewhere in that long, aching run through the trees and back roads of a sleeping town, Eli stopped being just a scared boy. He became something more. He became a voice for the voiceless. But they weren't safe yet. Not even close. Because the shadows weren't done. And what waited at the end of the road would force Eli to choose not just between right and wrong, but between sacrifice and salvation. The town was still asleep when Eli reached the edge of Main Street, his legs burning, throat raw from the cold air. The sun hadn't yet risen, but a soft gray light had begun to creep over the rooftops, casting long, sleepy shadows on the cracked sidewalks. He kept to the back alleys, moving low, Max glued to his side like a second shadow. The dog was limping again, barely noticeable, but Eli saw it, and it only deepened the urgency pressing in his chest. They reached the precinct just as the street lamps flickered off. It was a modest building, red brick, weather-worn, with 2 patrol cars out front and a wooden bench sagging beneath the weight of last fall's leaves. The American flag above the doorway stirred gently in the breeze, faded but still proud. Eli hesitated. What if they didn't believe him? What if they took Max away? What if he was the one accused of hiding evidence, of interfering, of lying? He looked down at Max, who was watching him with calm, loyal eyes. The same eyes that had followed him through every storm, every decision, every sleepless night. We're out of options, Eli whispered. This is all we've got. He stepped forward and pulled the heavy glass door open. The warmth inside hit him like a wave, dry, clean, filled with the faint scent of coffee and copier toner. The front desk was empty, except for a coffee mug with the name James scrawled in black marker. A second later, a tall man stepped into view from the hallway behind the desk. Clean-shaven, uniformed, eyes alert but kind. It was him, Officer James. He stopped in his tracks when he saw Eli. Morning, he said slowly, eyeing the mud on the boy's clothes, the way his hands trembled, the dog panting beside him. You all right, son? Eli didn't answer right away. His lips were dry. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. I think people are after him, he said, nodding toward Max. They came to our house. My grandma's alone. James's demeanor shifted instantly, not with panic, but with a quiet, purposeful focus. He stepped forward. Start from the beginning, he said. Take your time. Eli did. Right there in the lobby, standing on worn linoleum under flickering fluorescent lights, he told the story. From the night he found Max under the bridge, to the collar, to the flyer, to the men who broke into the trailer and chased them through the woods. Every word poured out like water from a dam that had finally cracked. James listened without interruption. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He didn't doubt. When Eli finished, there was a long silence. Then James knelt beside Max, examined the collar, the tag, and the faint scars across the dog's leg. He whistled low. "You've been through something, haven't you, boy?" he said softly, rubbing Max behind the ear. Max didn't flinch. He leaned in. James stood up. "You did the right thing coming here," he told Eli. "And I believe you." Eli felt something shift in his chest. Relief. Not full but enough to stand on. James picked up the phone. Made a few calls. Within minutes, 2 more officers arrived. Margaret was found safe, frightened, but unharmed. She'd locked herself in the bathroom the moment the door burst open. When the intruders found nothing, they vanished just as fast. No prints, no names, no trace. But James knew what it meant. "Someone's trying to clean something up," he said quietly, "and they think that dog saw too much." Eli felt the weight of it settle. Not just danger, but intent. Whoever wanted Max gone wasn't just chasing a reward. They were burying something. And Max was their loose thread. James looked at Eli, more serious now. "This won't be easy," he said. "If you stay with me, I can keep you both safe. But it means trusting the system. And sometimes, the system is slow." Eli looked at Max. The dog stared back, unwavering. "We don't need fast," he said. "Just right." James nodded. That evening, Eli and Max were moved to a safe location outside town, a small cabin in the hills used for witness protection during sensitive investigations. Margaret joined them shortly after, holding Eli so tightly he thought she might never let go. Max patrolled the porch like he had always belonged there, for the first time in weeks. Eli slept with both eyes closed. But even in safety, the truth still waited, and in the days to come, Max would begin to remember pieces of what he saw. And Eli would begin to understand just how deep the darkness truly ran. Because what they were up against wasn't just a mistake. It was a cover-up. And now, the cover was slipping. The morning the decision came down was colder than usual. A hard frost had crept in overnight, silvering the porch rails and frosting the windows of the small cabin where Eli, Margaret, and Max had been hiding for nearly a week. Inside, the wood stove crackled gently, casting a soft orange glow across the room. But no amount of warmth could reach the chill that had settled in Eli's chest. Officer James arrived just after sunrise. He parked his cruiser at the base of the drive and walked the rest of the way up on foot, out of respect, or maybe out of reluctance. He carried nothing but a clipboard and a folded jacket under his arm. When he stepped through the door, Eli already knew what the visit meant. They'd talked about it the night before quietly. After Margaret had gone to bed, Max curled between them like a living shadow. James had laid it out as gently as he could. Max's former unit had been located. Federal agents confirmed his identity through medical records embedded in the collar's data chip. They'd requested his return. "He's not just a dog, Eli," James had said softly. "He's a trained federal asset. There are legal steps here I can't block. I wish I could." Eli had nodded slowly. Not because he agreed, but because he understood. That was the hardest part of growing up, realizing that sometimes love doesn't win on paper. Now, as James stood in the doorway, Margaret beside him, with worry etched deep in her face, Eli took one last look at Max. The dog was sitting quietly by the hearth, his gaze steady, as if he, too, already knew. His posture was calm, his ears relaxed. But there was a question in his eyes, something wordless but piercing. Eli walked over, knelt down, and placed a hand gently on Max's chest. "You're going back to where you came from," he said quietly. "They need you. Maybe more than I do." Max leaned into his hand, his warm breath misting over Eli's sleeve. "But just so you know," Eli continued, voice thick with emotion, "you were never just a dog to me. You were my best friend. The first one I didn't have to pretend with. The first one who stayed." Tears welled up, blurring his view, but he kept going. "You saved me in ways no one else could, and I'd do it all again, Evan. If it ends like this." James stepped forward, kneeling beside them. He clipped a new leash onto Max's collar, but didn't pull. He waited. Eli leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently to Max's. The dog didn't move. His tail gave one soft wag, just one dot, and then Eli stood up. Max hesitated only for a moment, before following James toward the door. No whining, no resistance, just a quiet, loyal obedience that made the pain cut even deeper. As the door opened and the morning light spilled in, Max paused. He turned his head back, just once. Their eyes met Boy and Dogand. In that moment, no words were needed. Some goodbyes don't shout, they ache. The cruiser pulled away, wheels crunching over the gravel, disappearing down the winding hill road, until there was nothing left but silence. Eli didn't cry. Not then. He sat on the step of the cabin, hands in his lap, looking at the horizon like he was waiting for something to come back that never could. Margaret wrapped an arm around his shoulders and didn't speak. She knew grief doesn't always need fixing. Sometimes, it just needs company. But deep inside Eli, something had changed. Something had hardened not into anger, but into clarity. He had given up someone he loved because it was the right thing to do. Because Max wasn't his to keep. Because sometimes, letting go is a form of protection too. Still, questions lingered. Why had Max run in the first place? What had he seen? Who were those men? The answers hadn't come yet, but they would. Because James had made a promise. The investigation would continue, and Eli would be part of it. This wasn't the end. It was only the turning of the page. And as Eli watched the empty road, he whispered one last promise to the sky, as if Max could still hear it. You come back to me one day. You find your way home. I'll be here. I'll always be here. And somewhere, far away, in the back of a government vehicle, humming down a back road, a dog stared out the window, ears up, heart steady, as if he, too, remembered. The mornings after Max was gone felt like something had been taken out of the world, but no one remembered to fill the space. There was no sound of claws tapping on the wooden floor. No tail thumping gently against the side of the couch. Warm breath resting near Eli's side as he woke beneath the flannel blanket. The cabin was still. Not peaceful. Not quiet in the comforting sense. Just still like the silence that lingers after a favorite song ends and you realize it's not coming back. Eli rose early. Just as he always had. Out of habit, more than purpose. The sun spilled softly over the frost-glazed hills. The trees, bare and brittle in the wind. He sat by the window with his knees pulled to his chest, watching the world move on like it didn't notice something important had been taken. From it, Margaret did her best to keep things warm. She made pancakes. One morning, humming old hymns softly as the smell of butter filled the kitchen. But even she didn't ask Eli to eat. He sat at the table, poked at the food, and finally just whispered. He used to sit right there, nodding toward the floor beside his chair. She reached across the table, laid her hand gently over his. No words, just presence. Sometimes, presence is all that can be offered when grief runs too deep for language. Officer James called on the third day. He gave an update, said Max was back with his handlers, that the agency was reviewing old case files. He mentioned something about inconsistencies in reports, timelines that didn't add up, evidence that had gone missing. He said Max was cooperating. Eli smiled faintly at that. He's a dog, he said. He doesn't have to cooperate. He just has to remember. James agreed. And he does. Eli, he remembers. That night, Eli found the old blanket Max used to sleep on tucked under the bed, still marked by tufts of dark fur and the scent of something warm and loyal. He didn't cry. Not really. Just held the blanket close and stared out the window, wondering if Max was lying somewhere, staring at a window to dot the days stretched long. Too long he tried to go back to collecting recyclables, but the weight of the sack felt heavier now. Each alley, each turn through town, reminded him of the day he'd found Max in the rain, broken and bleeding beneath that overpass. Every corner of that memory was a wound still tender. The kids at the community pantry noticed. They asked where the dog was. Eli didn't answer. One boy said, he looked like a soldier, and Eli nodded. He still is, he thought. Back at the cabin, Margaret placed Max's food bowl in the cupboard. Eli didn't protest, but his eyes lingered on that empty spot on the floor, like something sacred had been erased. At night, the wind pressed against the windows again, and Eli would lie awake, staring at the wooden beams above him, listening, hoping for the faint shuffle of paws, the soft sigh of a sleeping dog beside his bed. But the nights were quiet, too quiet. Still, something inside him refused to believe this was the end. Max wasn't the kind of story that faded away. He was the kind that circled back when it mattered most, when the truth needed defending, when a promise made in silence was ready to be kept out, and soon, Eli would find out. The silence wasn't the end of the story, it was the breath before it began again. Back at the government facility, tucked behind steel gates and concrete walls, Max lay curled on a thin blanket, in a room that smelled of bleach and old files. The handlers called it a holding suite, But to Max, it was just quiet. Not the kind of quiet he'd come to lovelize quiet, filled with books and wood smoke, and whispered good nights. This was the sterile, hollow quiet of somewhere that didn't feel like home. The first day back, the handlers approached carefully, speaking in clipped tones, using commands he once knew by heart. Stay, search, heal. Max obeyed. Mostly, his body moved like it remembered. But his eyes, they didn't hold the fire they used to. He worked, but he didn't live. He ate his meals with mechanical disinterest, never racing to the bowl like he once did when Eli would sneak him slices of lunch meat or whisper, "You first, buddy." Now, Max would eat only when coaxed. Sometimes, not even then. Every morning, as the hallway lights clicked on, Max would rise from the blanket and walk to the glass door. He'd sit facing it, still as stone, ears pricked toward the hallway. He waited, and waited, and waited. The agents noticed. They said, "He's restless." They said, "Maybe he needs retraining." But they didn't understand. Max wasn't broken. He was waiting, not for food, not for orders, but for something that couldn't be scheduled or signed for. He was waiting for the boy. Some nights, the staff would find him standing at the end of the hallway near the exit, tail still, head low, like a sentry guarding a post no one else could see. If someone walked by wearing denim jeans or scuffed sneakers, his ears would perk for a moment, just a flicker and then fall again. In his sleep, he would twitch, dream, groan softly. Sometimes he barked once, a sharp echo in the still corridor. A few times, his paws moved, as if running through woods, over leaves, beside a boy he couldn't name but never forgot. The tech team logged his behaviors. They kept charts, monitored his vitals, but no chart could explain the way he refused to sleep unless the hallway lights dimmed just like the trailer cabin used to at bedtime. No sensor could read the ache behind his eyes every time a door opened and it wasn't him. The handlers grew frustrated. "He's unfocused," one said. "He's distracted," another noted. But James knew better. Officer James visited Max often, now offering small comforts, bits of roast beef from the diner, slow walks around the yard, moments of silence where no one asked Max to perform. James had seen it before with soldiers, with survivors. "He's grieving," James said one afternoon, gently stroking Max's thick fur. "He didn't just lose a handler. He lost a home." James sat on the bench near Max's kennel, watching the dog's eyes drift toward the glass again. Still waiting. Still loyal. "You miss him, don't you?" Max didn't respond, but James swore on everything decent left in the world. He saw the dog's tail move just slightly. Just once. That night, as Max lay in the dark, a distant siren wailed somewhere beyond the gates. The wind rattled the branches of the tall pine trees overhead. And for a moment, just a moment, Max lifted his head and stared at the ceiling, as if listening for footsteps that would never come. But deep in that silence, beneath the layers of discipline and loss, one thing stayed unshaken: hope. The kind of hope that doesn't fade with time. The kind that keeps a dog waiting by a door, long after the world tells him to forget. The kind that believes a boy's voice can find its way back, even across distance, even through duty, even against orders. Max waited, because real love doesn't know how to stop. And soon, fate would give him a reason to stand again. Because stories like his and Eli's don't end in quiet. They rise again in the sound of footsteps returning. It happened just after dusk, when the hills around the cabin glowed in amber light, and the sky held that in-between shade of blue, the hour when most folks settle in, thinking the worst of the day is already behind them. Eli was inside, helping Margaret prepare supper. The cabin smelled like warm cornbread and stew, the kind of smell that makes a place feel like safety. Margaret hummed as she stirred the pot. Eli was setting the table, placing the two mismatched bowls they always used, pausing now and then to glance at the empty corner by the fire, where Max used to curl up. Outside, the wind stirred the trees gently. Nothing seemed out of place until it did. The knock was soft, too soft for a neighbor, too polite for trouble. But it came again, 3 slow taps against the door. Then silence. Margaret froze. Eli looked at her. Neither of them moved. They weren't expecting anyone James hadn't called, and no one else knew they were here. Eli stepped quietly to the window, pulling the curtain back no more than a sliver. There was a man on the porch, mid-40s, dark jacket, clean-shaven. He wasn't dressed like an officer, and something in the way he stood, hands in pockets, back to straight, sent a chill down Eli's spine. "Don't answer it," Margaret whispered. But before they could back away, the doorknob turned. not forced, just tested. Slowly, then the voice came low, smooth, practiced. Evening. Sorry to trouble you. I'm looking for a lost dog. Thought you might have seen him pass through here. Eli's heart pounded. He stepped back from the window, hand gripping the edge of the kitchen table. Margaret moved silently to the drawer and retrieved the old pistol she hadn't touched in years, her hand shaking just slightly as she checked the chamber. We're not opening that door, she said, her voice firm now. Not unless it's James. But the man didn't knock again. Instead, they heard the slow creak of wood as he stepped off the porch. Then, another set of footsteps. And another. Eli's eyes widened. There's more than one. He was right. Shadows moved outside, flanking the cabin, circling slowly like wolves scenting a rabbit hole. Whoever they were, they didn't come to ask. They came to take. Eli rushed to the back door, bolting it tight. Then he grabbed the radio James had left behind, in case of emergency, and pressed the call button. James, it's Eli. Someone's here. 3, maybe more. They're looking for Max. Static, then silence. Then finally James's voice, tight and alert. Lock the doors. Stay away from the windows. I'm en route. Don't engage unless you have no choice. Eli set the radio down, chest heaving. Margaret was already moving, pushing a chair against the front door, flipping the light off. The cabin went dim, shadows stretching long across the floor. Eli grabbed the fireplace poker, his only weapon, and stood near the window. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then, a crash. The sound of glass shattering from the side of the house. Margaret raised the pistol, aimed at the hallway. Eli stepped in front of her instinctively, hands shaking but firm. Don't move, he whispered. Let them come to us. Footsteps inside now. Slow, testing the floorboards. Whoever these men were, they knew what they were doing. Then one of them spoke. We don't want the boy, just the dog. Eli's blood ran cold. They knew, not just about Max but him, his face, his connection, his hiding place. I don't have him, Eli shouted, voice cracking. He's not here. Silence. Then another voice, colder, closer. Then you won't mind if we look for ourselves. A shape appeared in the hallway, a figure with gloves, dark clothes, a flashlight slicing across the walls. Margaret didn't wait. The pistol fired once. The man ducked, stumbled backward, cursing, as he slammed into the hallway wall. Another pair of boots came running, but the gunshot had changed the tone. This wasn't easy anymore. This was resistance. Outside, red and blue lights suddenly cut through the trees. James, the sound of tires on gravel, doors opening, voices shouting. Intruders fled, slipping back through the window, out into the woods before backup could surround the house. One officer chased them. The rest rushed inside. James reached Eli first. You okay? He asked, grabbing the boy's shoulders. Eli nodded, though his whole body shook. They knew. They knew where we were. James looked at the broken glass, the footprints, the shattered calm of the room. He turned back to Eli, his face tight with realization. This isn't just about a missing dog anymore, he said. This is about what that dog knows. And now they know you're the one he trusts. Outside, the sirens faded into the background, but the fear remained. Margaret lowered the pistol, her hands finally stilled. Eli looked around the room, the broken window, the spilled stew, the chair still wedged against the door. He wasn't just protecting Max anymore. He was part of something bigger now. Something dangerous. And something was becoming painfully clear. If they were willing to come this far, they weren't going to stop. And the only way out now was through. The cabin didn't feel like a hiding place anymore. It felt like a countdown. Every creak of the porch, every rustle of branches outside, every silence between footsteps, sounded like a clock ticking toward something inevitable. Eli hadn't slept since the break-in. Margaret tried to stay strong, but even she couldn't hide the way her hands trembled when the wind shook the windows at night. That officer James stayed longer now. He brought backup. Men in plain clothes, parked discreetly in the woods, radios clipped to their belts, eyes always scanning the tree line. There was no more pretending that this was a simple case of a lost federal dog. Max had seen something, maybe during a raid, maybe during a transfer, maybe something he wasn't supposed to survive. And Eli, he had become the only person Max trusted. That made him a witness, by extension. One morning, as frost laced the edges of the porch and the sky sat heavy with snow that wouldn't fall, James sat across from Eli at the kitchen table. His voice was calm, but the look in his eyes was war-hardened. They'll come again, he said. Soon. They know you're still here. And they know we're watching. But they won't stop unless we make them. Eli didn't flinch. What do you mean? I mean we stop hiding, James replied. We set a trap. And we let them walk right into it. At first, Margaret was horrified. You're using my grandson as bait. But James explained. It wouldn't be reckless. It would be controlled. He and the team would be close. Every entrance covered. The idea was simple. Leak a message suggesting Max had been secretly returned to the cabin. A rumor. Just enough truth to bait the hook. Eli listened quietly. Then he looked up and said something that surprised them both. I'll do it. But only if I'm the one to draw them out. Margaret opened her mouth to protest. But Eli turned to her. They already came for us. Grandma, twice. If we don't end this, they'll never stop. Not for you. Not for Max. Not for anyone. She didn't like it. But she knew her grandson. He wasn't a child anymore. Not after all this. The plan moved fast. They sent a coded message through one of James's informants, hinting that Max had returned to the cabin under special protection, and that he was beginning to respond to certain commands from his former handlers. It was bait dressed as rumor, just credible enough to stir the waters. Within 48 hours, satellite surveillance picked up chatter encrypted, faint, but active. Someone was moving. Someone was preparing. That night, they set the trap. The cabin was prepped with surveillance, officers hid in the woods, motion sensors buried beneath dry leaves, drones circling in silence above the treetops. Eli stayed in the cabin, alone for show, but wired and constantly monitored. He didn't pace. He didn't hide. He sat in the same spot where Max used to sleep, holding the dog's old collar in his hand, like a memory too important to let go. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Then dash movement. Infrared picked up 3 bodies, moving through the trees. No lights, no sounds. They knew what they were doing. James's voice came through Eli's earpiece. They're coming. Stay still. The first shadow appeared at the side window, then another at the back. A soft tap at the door like before. Eli didn't move. Open up, kid. A low voice whispered through the crack. We know he's in there. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Another pause. Then the door creaked half an inch. A boot stepped inside. That was enough. In a flash, the lights burst on. Officers stormed from the trees. The door slammed open, and James was the first inside, weapon drawn. Federal agents. On the ground, the men didn't resist. They froze, caught in a trap, too tight to wriggle from. One of them turned toward Eli before being cuffed. You think this ends here? He hissed. You don't know what that dog saw. James shoved him toward the waiting vehicle. Oh, I think we do, he said. And now, the world will too. Within an hour, the cabin was quiet again. The men were in custody. Hard drives, phones, and documents taken from their pockets were already being processed. James sat beside Eli, who hadn't spoken since the door opened. You okay? He asked. Eli nodded, eyes still fixed on the empty corner where Max once lay. It's not over, he said quietly. But at least now, we're not the ones running. James placed a hand on his shoulder. You were brave tonight, Eli. Braver than most grown men I've known. Outside, dawn was beginning to press through the trees, lightening the edges of the long, dark night. And though Max was still miles away, in a government facility behind locked gates and trained voices, something in that morning air felt different, like a promise had just begun to keep itself, and soon, that promise would come home. The footage from the cabin was all over the news. Within 48 hours, 3 armed men, caught red-handed by a coordinated federal sting, tied directly to an internal cover-up that had gone undetected for months. The kind of case that made headlines in slow towns and whispered conversations in government offices. And yet, in all those headlines, one detail stood out: not the arrests, not the charges, but the reason the story cracked open in the first place. A boy and his dog. Max's name was never officially printed, but his face's stance at the door, the old footage of his service days, and a single blurry photo of him curled beside a young boy in a flannel blanket circulated like wildfire. Somewhere in the country's quiet conscience, Max had become more than a canine unit. He had become a symbol of loyalty, and Eli, the stubborn, skinny boy from nowhere, had become the reason that loyalty still had a chance to matter. When James visited the facility that week, Max was different. Not just responsive, alive. The dog had started to eat again. His ears twitched when the door opened. His tail wagged, not wildly, but with purpose. James didn't need to say anything. Max had seen the broadcast too. from the corner of the rec room, and though he couldn't speak, his posture told the whole story. He remembered Dot, so James made the call Dot, and 3 days later, Max was loaded into the back of the cruiser, not as a prisoner, not as a federal asset in need of discipline, but as a hero returning to where he belonged. The drive through the hills was quiet. James didn't talk much, and Max didn't need words. Every turn in the road, every change in the scent of the air, made his tail beat just a little harder. By the time the cruiser pulled into the clearing where the cabin sat, Max was standing tall, nose pressed to the window, breath fogging the glass. Eli was on the porch when they arrived. He didn't run, he didn't shout. He just stood there, one hand clenched tight around the old collar he'd never let go of. James opened the car door. Max stepped out. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Max looked up, ears alert, and Eli called just once. Max, the dog sprinted forward, full force, barreling up the porch steps like time had folded in on itself. Eli dropped to his knees, arms open, and Max collided into him, with all the weight of something sacred finding its way home. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Friendship had found its way back, not through luck or accident, but through choice, through faith, through the quiet defiance of two souls who refused to let go of each other, even when the world tried to tear them apart. That night, they all sat together around the wood. Stovili, Margaret, James, and Max, whose head rested gently on Eli's lap, eyes finally closed in real sleep. Margaret wiped away a tear and smiled. Looks like he came back with a little more fire in him. James nodded. So did the boy. But they all knew it wasn't over yet, because friendship doesn't just wait. It doesn't just return. Sometimes, when pushed to the edge, when injustice strikes too close to home, when silence becomes unbearable, friendship fights back, and in the days to come, Eli and Max would do just that. Not with fists, not with fury, but with truth, and the courage to tell it. The reunion wasn't just a moment, it was a reminder that in a world full of locked doors and broken promises, sometimes the things that matter most do find their way back home. Word spread quickly. The boy and the dog, separated by duty and danger, had been reunited in the most unexpected way. What began as a hidden bond in a backwoods trailer had now become something much larger. News crews came, not with harsh questions or bright lights, but with gentleness. They asked Eli to speak, and though he was never one for crowds, he stood quietly on the porch beside Max and told the truth in a voice that wavered but didn't break. I didn't find Max. He found me. And when I had nothing, he gave me something to protect. Behind him, Margaret stood in the doorway, hands folded over her chest, tears in her eyes. She didn't need to speak. The way she looked at Max then, at Eli, said everything about what it means to hold on when letting go seems easier. Even the camera crews stepped back when Max climbed into Eli's lap, mid-interview, and curled into a ball like he had never left. The boom mic caught it, the soft sigh that only came from a dog that had finally stopped holding his breath. The world didn't see just a reunion. They saw healing. They saw hope. Veterans who had served alongside K9 units rode in by the hundreds. Letters, emails, handwritten notes, some with trembling script and old military stamps. They thanked Eli, not for rescuing a dog but for reminding people that those animals were more than tools. They were brothers, partners, family. A retired officer from Pennsylvania sent a silver tag with the word honor engraved on it, along with a short note. He waited. That means everything. Max wore the tag on his collar from that day forward. The reunion brought with it more than affectionate, brought attention. Officials reopened old files Max had been attached to. They reviewed footage, re-interviewed witnesses, and traced back every detail of the cases the dog had been assigned before he went missing. And just like Eli had sensed, the truth was waiting, buried beneath red tape and silence. Pieces started falling into place, names, locations, actions that never should have happened. People who thought no one was watching suddenly realized someone had been, and that someone had 4 legs, a scar on his side, and eyes that never forgot. The media called it a miracle. A boy, a dog, and a trail of truth that refused to stay buried. But for Eli, none of that mattered more than the sound Max made every morning. Now soft steps on the cabin floor, the stretch and yawn of a creature at peace, the low whine that meant I'm ready for the day. They walked again through the same woods, past the same river, under the same sky where it all began. Sometimes Eli would talk to Max out loud, like nothing had changed. Other times, he'd walk in silence, just grateful for the rhythm of pause. Beside him, Margaret said it best. One evening, as they watched the two silhouetted against the setting sun, "Some reunions are loud," she murmured, sipping tea. "But the ones that matter, they don't need noise. They just fit, like they were never apart." And as fall turned to winter again, the fire burned steadily inside their little home, not just in the hearth, but in their hearts. Because while the world had seen a reunion that melted hearts, Eli and Max knew the truth. This wasn't the end of something broken, it was the beginning of something whole. And what came next would only make that bond stronger. It began as a whisper, a quiet story out of a nowhere town, just a boy and his dog. But sometimes, it's the quiet stories that speak the loudest. And before long, Eli and Max's journey was on every screen, in every living room, in every conversation that still believed in things like loyalty, courage, and love that doesn't break under pressure. News anchors, usually hardened by headlines, paused mid-broadcast with wet eyes as they told the tale, not of a heroic rescue, not of a breaking scandal, but of a bondro, honest and rare, the kind that doesn't ask for attention, but earns it. Photos of Max resting his head on Eli's lap filled the front pages. The image of that first reunion on the cabin porch was printed on posters and shared in classrooms, coffee shops, veterans' halls. For days, the nation stopped scrolling and started listening. Letters came by the truckload from mothers who had lost sons in service, saying, "I wish someone had stood by our dog the way your boy did." From elderly veterans, one of whom wrote in careful, shaky pen, "I had a Max once too. We both came home broken. You reminded me why we made it back." A high school teacher in Montana assigned Eli's story as a reading project in her class. A retired handler from Virginia offered to train Max further at no cost, just to honor what he called the most loyal civilian canine I've ever read about. The mayor of their hometown declared a community day in Max's name, Loyalty Day, not for flags or fireworks, but for quiet acts of standing by those who can't speak for themselves. Eli, still just a boy, never asked for the spotlight. He didn't enjoy it. He'd shy away from cameras, answer interviews with as few words as he could manage. But when he did speak, people listened. Because what came from his mouth wasn't performance, it was proof. That strength doesn't come from size. That love isn't measured in how loud it shouts, but in how long it stays. He stood before a packed auditorium one evening, not as a hero, but as a kid who just refused to give up. "They told me he was just a dog," he said softly, eyes flicking to Max, lying faithfully at the edge of the stage. "But I think sometimes the ones who don't speak are the ones who teach us the most." The audience didn't clap right away. They just stood, quietly, tears in their eyes. Then, slowly, the room filled with applause, not thunderous, but steady, like a heartbeat. Margaret watched from the wings, hand over her heart, and whispered to James beside her, "He's not just growing up, he's becoming." The Department of Justice launched a full internal review into the agency that lost Max. Arrests were made, evidence recovered, and in every press release, somewhere near the bottom, there was a single line that repeated like a drumbeat across every update. None of this would have come to light if not for the perseverance of a young boy and the loyalty of one forgotten dog. America didn't just embrace the story, it needed it. In a time of noise and division, Eli and Max reminded people of something simpler, that faith still matters, that bonds don't need words, and that sometimes, the purest kind of strength is simply not letting go. And yet, even as the nation watched, celebrated, and wept with them, back at the cabin, not much changed. Eli still woke up before sunrise. Max still slept curled beside the fireplace. Margaret still made too much tea and hummed gospel songs that no one else remembered the words to. Because for all the world had seen, for all the awards and interviews and invitations, they all knew this story was never about headlines. It was about home. And what it takes to protect it. What came next wasn't a celebration, it was a beginning, and soon, Eli and Max would be offered a choice that would shape not just their future, but what their story would stand for forever. Spring came, quietly to the hills around the cabin. The snow melted slow, leaving behind muddy trails and the green whisper of wild grass, stretching toward the light. Birds returned, nesting in the eaves, and the trees began to dress themselves again, modest at first, then proud in full bloom. Life was waking up, so were they. Eli no longer walked with the same weight in his shoulders. There was still a scar of caution in him. Yes, but now, it sat beside something else, belonging. Max stayed close, always within a few steps, never needing a leash. The way he moved beside Eli was more than trained behavior. It was rhythm, familiarity, like two pieces of the same melody finally in sync. Officer James came by one afternoon, in early May, with news that didn't quite fit into a single sentence. He stood on the porch, hat in hand, a hopeful smile on his face, and told Eli and Margaret that a program had been created, the Canine Legacy Act, partly inspired by their story. It would provide permanent homes for retired service dogs and training grants for handlers who wanted to continue working with them as partners, not property. But that wasn't all. Max has been officially retired from federal service, James said gently, which means he doesn't belong to the government anymore. Eli's breath caught. Margaret leaned forward in her chair. So what happens to him now? James looked at the boy, then knelt beside Max, who had been quietly wagging his tail the whole time, like he already knew. Well, James said, there's a form. Just one. If someone wants to adopt him permanently, make it official. Give him a home, that is, if you're still interested. Eli didn't answer with words. He dropped to his knees and wrapped his arms around Max's thick neck, pressing his cheek into the dog's fur. The collar jingled softly between them. Max leaned into the hug without hesitation. It was done. The paperwork was signed on the kitchen table that same afternoon. Margaret baked cornbread to celebrate, and James brought a new tag for Max's collaring, graved in simple block letters, MAX family. Eli spent the next few days getting used to the idea that Max wasn't going anywhere, not on someone else's orders, not under threat, not because of duty, but because this was home. The government offered to relocate them to town, a better house, paved roads, security. But Margaret said no. We don't need better, she told the official. On the phone, we have right. And that's more than most folks get in this life. So they stayed. And slowly, the cabin changed, not with renovations or money, but with light. Eli and Max built a fenced area out back for training. Not obedience drills, but games, learning together, growing. They even hosted a few younger kids from the community center. Max, ever patient, let them stumble through commands, while Eli taught them what he'd learned the hard way. That trust isn't built in a day, but it lasts a lifetime. At night, Max curled beside the fire, like he always had, his breathing deep and content, and Eli, sometimes still in his clothes from a long day of chores, would fall asleep beside him, head resting on Max's side. One hand tangled in his fur like an anchor. James kept coming by, not as a cop, as a friend. Sometimes he brought dog food, sometimes just coffee. And every time he left, he'd pat Max on the head and say, "Take care of your boy." Max always did. And while the world moved on, headlines fading, attention shifting, what Eli and Max built didn't depend on the spotlight. It lived in shared walks at sunrise, muddy footprints on the porch, the quiet way Max would nudge Eli's elbow when he sensed something heavy weighing him down. This was a new beginning, not just a reunion, not just survival, but the life they were never supposed to have and now, finally, got to choose. And as the summer approached, with wildflowers blooming in every direction, a letter arrived. Not just for Eli, for both of them, an invitation. And what that letter held would bring them face to face with a moment neither had expected. One final stage, one final choice, and one chance to show the world what love, loyalty, and quiet courage could become when they're allowed to grow together. The letter arrived in a plain envelope, no return address, just Eli's name written in neat, almost military script. Inside was an invitation typed formal, but lined with warmth beneath the words. The National Canine Honor Foundation was holding a tribute in Washington, D.C., to recognize working dogs who had served beyond expectation. Max's name was at the top of the list. Eli read it once, then twice. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the strange feeling of being seen. Margaret looked over his shoulder and whispered, "They finally understand what he was to you, and what you were to him." The trip wasn't easy. They'd never been outside their corner of the state. The city loomed big, with its polished buildings and wide cold stone. But the foundation sent a car. They sent hotel reservations. They even arranged someone to care for Margaret while Eli and Max attended the event. Max was uneasy at first, surrounded by polished shoes and flashing cameras. But the moment he stepped onto the stage beside Eli, the tension left his body. Because Eli was calm, and Max had learned long ago, wherever the boy stood still, the ground was safe. They walked out to a quiet standing ovation, not roaring applause. Just the kind that hums, steady, like people clapping not just with their hands, but with their hearts. There were medals, speeches, but it was Eli's voice, small and steady at the microphone, that stilled the entire room. "I thought I rescued him," he said, one hand resting on Max's shoulder. "But really, he rescued me. He taught me how to stay, how to trust, how to matter. He wasn't just a working dog. He was my family. And this isn't a ceremony. It's a thank you for the home he gave me when I didn't have one." The room didn't move for a long moment. Then, slowly, every person in attendance stood, not for politics, not for ceremony, but for love, and for the quiet kind of courage that doesn't wear a uniform but walks beside you on four legs and never once asks for anything in return. Afterward, as the sun dipped behind the marble buildings, a woman approached them in the lobby, elderly, elegant, with tears at the corner of her eyes. "My son served with a dog like him," she said. "He never made it home, but the dog did, and he waited at our porch for 3 days. We never forgot. Thank you for giving the world a reason to remember." Eli nodded, not trusting his voice. They returned to the hills 2 days later, to the cabin, to the porch with the sagging rail and the wind chimes Margaret hung every spring. They unpacked the medal and the plaque. Margaret cleaned a spot on the shelf. But Max didn't care for medals. He trotted over to the corner by the fire, turned in 3 slow circles, and curled into his usual spot with a sigh that said everything. This was his award. This was home. Forever. Eli sat beside him, leaned back against the wall, and stared out the window as the sky darkened and the first stars blinked into view. He could have gone anywhere. Now college scholarships were being offered, books being written, interviews scheduled. But in that moment, none of that mattered, because home wasn't a place you found. It was something you earned, with trust, with loyalty, with choosing each other again and again, even when the world gave you 1,000 reasons not to. And Eli had made his choice. So had Max. Forever wasn't a word they used. It was just the way they lived. There are stories that entertain, stories that inform them. Then, every once in a while, there are stories that remind us who we are. Eli and Max's journey was never about fame, or medals, or headlines. It began in the quiet between, a boy who had lost too much too soon, and a wounded dog no one believed would trust again. It grew not from big gestures, but from small choices. A piece of bread shared, a wound cleaned without complaint, a cold night endured side by side. What this story teaches us isn't complicated. It's not dressed up in grand speeches or polished morals. It's simple, but it's powerful. That loyalty is a language stronger than words. That kindness given freely without the expectation of return is never wasted. That bravery isn't always about facing danger head. Sometimes, it's just staying when others walk away. Eli could have turned Max in the moment he discovered the collar. He could have taken the reward, eased his burdens, walked away from the risk. No one would have blamed him. But he didn't, because something deep inside him, a voice older than his years, knew that some lives aren't meant to be bartered. They're meant to be kept safe. But Max could have run again, could have retreated into silence and obedience. But he didn't, because he found something stronger than commands. He found home in a boy's quiet presence, and chose to stay in when the world came hunting for him. Together, they showed us that you don't have to be powerful to change something. You just have to be present. You just have to care. And through every moment, every cold morning, every broken window, every decision to stay, they stitched together something bigger than survival. They built a story that made a nation pause. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. Eli didn't save the world, but he saved someone. And sometimes, that's how the world does get saved. So, if you've ever wondered if one act of compassion makes a difference, if standing by someone, even when it costs you, is worth it, remember the boy who gave up safety to protect a soul no one else would. Remember the dog who waited against logic, against time, because he believed in something he couldn't explain. And remember that in a world filled with noise, there's nothing more powerful than two quiet hearts choosing each other and never letting go. That's what this story teaches us: not to be perfect, not to be fearless, but simply to be faithful, to keep showing up, to keep choosing love, and to remember that sometimes, even in the darkest moments, loyalty, pure, stubborn, and unspoken, can light the way home.